Joseph Duggar always played the quiet, sweet, agreeable brother on television, fading into the background of a chaotic mega family. But behind that gentle, camera-ready smile was a staggering arrogance born from a lifetime of extreme religious shielding. He honestly believed his carefully cultivated status as a good Christian boy gave him a permanent get-out-of-jail-free card. In a twist of absolute staggering irony, it was this exact hubris that brought him down. He was so deeply conditioned to believe he was untouchable that he willingly confessed to a horrific felony over the phone, directly to his victim's furious father. He thought he was participating in a private, spiritual reckoning, totally unaware he was walking straight into a meticulously planned police trap. Before we dive deep into the shocking details of how this trap was set, I need you to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. We are exposing the darkest exclusive theories and bringing you the most jaw-dropping recent updates on the Duggar family's spectacular downfall. And you do not want to miss a single second of what we uncover next. To understand how Joseph Duggar could be so unbelievably foolish, we have to pull back the curtain on the bizarre, insulated world he was raised in. For decades, the Duggar family operated under the absolute authority of the Institute in Basic Life Principles, a fundamentalist group that functions essentially as a shadow government for its followers. Within the IBLP cult, conflicts are never, ever handled in a secular court of law. You do not call the cops. You do not file a police report. You call the church elders. You call Jim Bob Duggar. Joseph was raised in a highly structured patriarchal system where sins, no matter how heinous or illegal, were dealt with entirely in-house. The protocol was simple and deeply toxic. If a transgression occurred, it was met with private apologies, forced tears of repentance, intense prayer sessions, and then sweeping the entire ordeal under the rug to protect the precious family name. The victim's trauma was always secondary to the reputation of the ministry. Joseph was practically breastfed on the idea that as long as you confessed to a spiritual superior and asked for God's forgiveness, your worldly slate was wiped clean. He grew up watching his parents shield his oldest brother from the consequences of unspeakable acts, learning a very dangerous lesson early on. He learned that the rules of the outside world simply did not apply to a Duggar. This false image of a wholesome, untouchable dynasty became the very foundation of Joseph's psychological makeup. He felt utterly invulnerable, wrapped in a religious armor that he thought could never be pierced by secular authorities. But the world outside the Duggar compound was changing rapidly, and the first massive cracks in their impenetrable shield had already begun to show. The secular world had been closing in on the Duggars for years, steadily dismantling their wholesome facade brick by brick. When the federal government raided Josh Duggar's car lot, the illusion of IBLP invincibility was completely shattered. The feds did not care about Josh's supposed spiritual repentance. They did not care how many Bible verses Jim Bob could quote, and they certainly didn't care about the family's television ratings. The public had stopped buying the Duggars' innocent act a long time ago, watching with morbid fascination as the family's dark underbelly was dragged into the harsh light of a federal courtroom. Yet, somehow, amidst the ruins of his family's reputation, Joseph remained completely blind to his own vulnerability. He watched his older brother get sentenced to over a decade in federal prison. Yet his massive ego convinced him that he was different. He believed Josh's downfall was a result of digital evidence and sheer stupidity, not a fundamental flaw in how the family operated. Joseph ignored the blaring warning sirens that the IBLP shield was broken forever. He continued to live his life with the same dangerous arrogance, assuming the deeply ingrained, unwritten rules of silence and compliance would continue to protect him, even as the walls of the Duggar empire were crumbling all around him. The true catalyst for Joseph's downfall, the moment that sparked the unstoppable chain reaction leading to his ultimate ruin, arrived in March of 2026. This recent update in our exclusive theories paints a harrowing picture of a brave survivor finally finding her voice. A young girl, just 14 years old at the time of the alleged incident, walked through the doors of the Tontitown Police Department. She was terrified but resolute, carrying a heavy burden she had been forced to shoulder in silence for years. Sitting across from detectives, she began to detail the horrifying abuse she endured at the hands of Joseph Duggar during a chaotic family trip to Panama City Beach in the summer of 2020. Panama City Beach was supposed to be a joyous getaway, a massive gathering of the ever-expanding Duggar clan filled with sunshine, fellowship, and family bonding. But behind closed doors in their sprawling, crowded rental house, the reality was a nightmare. The Duggar family's notorious buddy system, where older siblings are essentially tasked with raising and monitoring the younger ones, created a chaotic environment with massive blind spots. With so many children running around and adults distracted by filming schedules or endless social gatherings, supervision was merely an illusion. It was in these dark, unsupervised pockets of time that Joseph allegedly cornered his victim. For years, the young girl was paralyzed by the psychological chains of the IBLP. She knew the protocol. She knew that if she spoke up, she would be branded a liar, a troublemaker, or worse, blamed for tempting a righteous man. She knew her family would be pressured by Jim Bob to keep quiet to avoid a scandal. But as she watched the documentary expose air, as she saw Josh locked away, and as she realized the outside world would actually listen to victims, a fierce courage began to take root. March 2026 was the breaking point. She could no longer live with the ghost of Panama City Beach. Her detailed, gut-wrenching account to the Town police set off a silent alarm that bypassed the Duggar compound entirely. When the victim finally broke down and confessed the dark truth to her father, the man's world stopped turning. The blinding rage of a father discovering his precious daughter had been preyed upon by someone trusted, someone parading as a beacon of Christian morality, is a force of nature. But this father did not act on blind, physical vengeance. If he had driven to the Duggar compound and beaten Joseph to a pulp, he would have been the one in handcuffs, and the IBLP spin machine would have painted Joseph as a martyr. Instead, the father played a brilliant, calculated game. He channeled his fury into a cold, methodical pursuit of justice. He immediately partnered with law enforcement. The Town police, already well-versed in the deceptive tactics of the Duggar family, knew exactly how to handle a predator accustomed to religious cover-ups. They knew that if they simply knocked on Joseph's door, Jim Bob's lawyers would descend like vultures, locking down every family member and drowning the investigation in legal red tape. To catch a Duggar, they needed the confession, before the family even knew there was an investigation. This brings us to the astonishing hubris of Joseph Duggar. Instead of immediately lawyering up when the victim's furious father reached out to confront him, Joseph relied entirely on his cult training. When his phone rang and he heard the trembling, angry voice of the father demanding answers about Panama City Beach, any normal person with something to hide would have hung up. Any smart criminal would have immediately called an attorney. But Joseph was not a smart criminal. He was an arrogant product of a completely insulated cult. He assumed this was just another internal IBLP matter. He thought he was having a private, brother-to-brother religious confrontation. In his twisted mind, this was simply the first step in the familiar dance of cult conflict resolution. He believed the father was calling to extract an apology, demand spiritual repentance, and then agree to pray about it, ultimately ending in forced forgiveness to protect the broader Christian community from secular scandal. Joseph leaned back, completely relaxed in his delusion, and prepared to play the role of the humble, repentant sinner. He planned to offer a few hollow tears, a couple of practiced Bible verses about grace and human weakness, and then move on with his life as if nothing had happened. He severely underestimated the righteous fury of a betrayed father, and he completely failed to realize that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. The era of Duggar invincibility was dead, but Joseph's arrogance blinded him to the grave he was actively digging with his own words. He was about to give the police exactly what they needed, wrapping a neat bow around his own destruction. The scene inside the Town Police Department on the day of the phone call was straight out of a tense psychological thriller. Detectives had set up a secure room, outfitting the victim's father with specialized recording equipment. They sat across from him in total silence, headphones secured, watching the digital audio recorder blink a steady, ominous red. The father's hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the massive weight of the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He was about to confront the monster who had destroyed his daughter's innocence, and he had to do it using the exact twisted language of the cult they had all once belonged to. The police had coached him meticulously. They told him not to yell, not to make overt threats of violence, and absolutely not to mention law enforcement. He had to play the role of the deeply wounded but spiritually seeking patriarch. He needed to bait the hook with the one thing Joseph Duggar was conditioned to crave in times of trouble: the promise of private, biblical forgiveness. When the father dialed the number, the tension in that small police room was thick enough to cut with a knife. On the other end of the line, Joseph Duggar was likely going about his perfectly curated, mundane life, completely oblivious to the legal crosshairs locking onto his forehead. When he answered his phone, his tone was casual, perhaps even cheerful. But the second the victim's father identified himself and mentioned Panama City Beach, the temperature in the conversation plummeted. For a brief second, there must have been a spike of panic in Joseph's chest. But then, his decades of intense institute in basic life principles indoctrination kicked into high gear. The father, delivering an Oscar-worthy performance of a grieving church member, told Joseph that his daughter had finally confessed the burden of what happened on that 2020 trip. He told Joseph that as a father, his heart was broken, but as a fellow Christian brother, he was seeking the full truth so that their families could begin the painful process of spiritual healing and reconciliation. It was the ultimate trap, perfectly designed for a man whose entire worldview was built on religious loopholes. Instead of hanging up and calling Jim Bob's army of defense attorneys, Joseph Duggar leaned right into the snare. Believing he was utterly untouchable, Joseph began to speak. And he didn't just speak, he poured out a legally binding, completely uncoerced confession on a recorded line. The arrest affidavit reveals the staggering details of this epic sting operation. As the detectives listened in real time, their jaws practically hit the floor. Criminals usually try to minimize their actions, deflect blame, or deny everything outright. But Joseph, operating under the fatal delusion that this was a confidential church matter, openly admitted to the horrific actions. He used the sickening, minimizing language of his cult, reportedly referring to his actions as a momentary stumbling block, a weakness of the flesh, and an attack by the enemy to bring down a righteous family. But in his attempt to sound spiritually repentant, he confirmed the timeline. He confirmed the location in Panama City Beach. He confirmed the lack of supervision, and most damning of all, he confirmed the specific, horrifying details of what he did to a 14-year-old child. The father, holding his composure through sheer, superhuman willpower, gently pushed for more clarity, insisting he needed to know the full extent of the darkness so he could fully forgive him. And Joseph, overflowing with arrogant hubris, handed over every single piece of the puzzle. He essentially dictated his own arrest warrant, step by sickening step. He thought he was closing a chapter on a dirty little secret, securing the father's silence through the mutual bond of their fundamentalist religion. He even had the audacity to ask the father to pray with him over the phone, to ask God to wash the sin away and keep their families united against the secular world. The detectives in the room could barely believe what they were capturing. In a matter of minutes, Joseph Duggar had handed them a slam-dunk, airtight case that no high-priced lawyer could ever dismantle. He had bypassed the statute of limitations debates, the hearsay arguments, and the typical victim-blaming strategies his family was so infamous for utilizing. He gave them his own voice, calmly admitting to a felony. The sheer, monumental betrayal of the IBLP system that this phone call represented cannot be overstated. For generations, the unwritten rule of silence was the absolute bedrock of the Duggar empire. You protected the abuser to protect the ministry. The victim's family completely shattered that rule, tearing the entire corrupt ideology down to its studs. By coordinating with law enforcement instead of bringing the issue to Jim Bob Duggar, they committed the ultimate act of treason against the cult. They recognized that the internal justice system of their religion was nothing more than a meat grinder for victims and a sanctuary for predators. They legally and utterly betrayed the Duggar system of cover-ups, and in doing so, they completely isolated Joseph from any chance of a quiet settlement. In the past, Jim Bob would have intervened. He would have flown the victim's family to the compound, offered them a settlement, forced intense mediation sessions with church elders, and emotionally blackmailed everyone into submission. But because the victim's father went completely rogue and went straight to the police, Jim Bob was entirely cut out of the equation. He had zero leverage, zero control, and absolutely no idea that his son had just handed his life away on a silver platter. The scramble for damage control didn't begin until the Tontitown police rolled up to Joseph's property. Imagine the sheer, unadulterated shock on his face when he opened his door expecting a friendly neighbor or a church member, only to find grim-faced detectives holding an arrest warrant. In his mind, the issue had been resolved. He had confessed to the father. He had prayed about it. The slate was supposed to be clean. The moment the steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the terrifying reality of his situation violently crashed down upon him. This was not a church disciplinary meeting. This was not a private family council. This was the state of Arkansas, acting in coordination with authorities in Bay County, Florida, where the crime took place, formally charging him with a devastating felony. Once in the interrogation room, the devastating truth was finally laid bare. Joseph, likely still trying to play the polite, cooperative reality star, probably expected to explain away the situation, maybe even trying to tell the police that the victim's father had already forgiven him. But then the detectives played their trump card. They revealed the existence of the audio recording. They watched the blood drain from Joseph's face as the realization of his fatal error settled into his bones. The very doctrine he had used to justify his behavior, the cult teachings that told him a private confession was enough to erase a crime, was exactly what had led him straight into a federal-level trap. He tried to backpedal. Exclusive theories suggest he immediately began to stutter, attempting to retract his statements, claiming he was intimidated, claiming he was just saying what the father wanted to hear to keep the peace. But it was far, far too late. The recorded confession was fully documented, transcribed, handed over to the prosecutors in Bay County, and instantly became the absolute, unshakable centerpiece of the state's case against him. The frantic scrambling behind the scenes at the Duggar compound must have been apocalyptic. When Jim Bob Duggar received the phone call that yet another one of his supposedly perfect sons was in handcuffs, the panic would have been blinding. The family's crisis PR machine, already running on fumes after Josh's conviction, was thrown into utter chaos. They couldn't use their usual playbook. They couldn't claim it was youthful indiscretion, and they couldn't claim they were dealing with it internally because the secular authorities had completely blindsided them. Jim Bob realized with absolute horror that the victim's family had outsmarted him. They had weaponized the cult's own reliance on internal confessions against them. The absolute isolation of Joseph Duggar in that moment was profound. He was sitting in a holding cell, stripped of his television fame, stripped of his father's protective umbrella, and stripped of the false righteousness he had worn like a costume his entire life. The realization that he had willingly tracked himself, that his own overwhelming arrogance and blind faith in a corrupt religious system had sealed his fate, must have been psychologically agonizing. He had walked willingly into the slaughterhouse, convinced he was the butcher, only to find out he was the prize pig. This brings us to the absolute, jaw-dropping ultimate irony of this entire horrifying saga. When you strip away the reality television fame, the magazine covers, and the carefully choreographed political campaigns of the Duggar family, you are left with the chilling reality of their fundamentalist upbringing. Joseph Duggar was born, raised, and completely immersed in an ideology that actively rejects the modern legal system in favor of a twisted, patriarchal hierarchy. He was taught from the time he could walk that the only authority that truly mattered was the authority of the Father, the church elders, and ultimately, God. The secular justice system was viewed as an enemy, a worldly distraction that had no jurisdiction over the righteous. In the Institute in Basic Life Principles, there is a core teaching often referred to as clearing your conscience. This doctrine mandates that if you commit a wrong, even a grievous, unspeakable wrong, your primary duty is to confess it to the specific individual you harmed, or, in the case of a female victim, to her father, who serves as her spiritual umbrella of protection. You offer a tearful apology. You ask for forgiveness. And once that forgiveness is verbally granted, the sin is supposedly erased from existence. There is no concept of legal restitution. There is no concept of paying a debt to society or facing a judge. The cult teaches that worldly consequences are unnecessary once spiritual harmony has been restored by a patriarch. This exact, incredibly dangerous indoctrination is the precise mechanism that destroyed Joseph Duggar. He was so deeply brainwashed by this system that he genuinely believed apologizing to the victim's father was the beginning and the end of the issue. He believed that by following the cult's specific blueprint for conflict resolution, he was completely insulating himself from any worldly consequences. He thought the father was playing by the same ancient, unspoken rules of their shared religion. The staggering irony is that this strict fundamentalist upbringing, the very system designed by Bill Gothard and weaponized by Joseph Duggar to protect abusers and silence victims, is the exact thing that handed the police a legally binding, crystal-clear confession. If Joseph had been raised in a normal environment, he would have recognized the immense legal danger of discussing a crime on a phone call. He would have known about Miranda rights, self-incrimination, and the basic fact that apologizing for a felony does not make the felony disappear. But his brain was completely rewired by decades of cult conditioning. His obedience to the IBLP protocol was his ultimate undoing. By doing exactly what he was trained to do, confessing to a spiritual superior to keep the matter out of the secular courts, he built his own prison cell, brick by brick. His own lifelong indoctrination, the very armor he thought made him invincible, was actually a straitjacket that he eagerly strapped himself into. Think about the sheer poetic justice of this recent update in our exclusive theories. For years, the Duggar family used their religion as an impenetrable fortress. They hid behind their massive Bibles, their modest clothing, and their perfectly rehearsed smiles, using their faith as a weapon to intimidate anyone who dared question their actions. They forced victims into silent submission by convincing them that speaking out against an abuser was a direct sin against God. They controlled the narrative with an iron fist, ensuring that every scandal was buried under layers of forced family prayers and deceptive public statements. But in this case, the victim's father completely flipped the script. He took the cult's most powerful weapon, the internal, off-the-books confession, and turned it into a lethal legal snare. He weaponized Joseph's blind obedience against him. Joseph Duggar did not just stumble into a police trap. He was led there by the very teachings he held so dear. He thought his status as a good, rule-following Christian boy meant the father would naturally show him grace and sweep the nightmare in Panama City Beach under the rug, just like Jim Bob had done so many times before. He relied on the father's supposed fundamentalist duty to protect the broader Christian community's reputation. What he fundamentally failed to grasp was that a parent's love for their child will always shatter the fragile, toxic chains of a cult when pushed to the absolute breaking point. The father discarded the unwritten rules of the IBLP the second he learned what happened to his little girl. But he knew Joseph was still operating under them. The ultimate irony is that Joseph's profound arrogance, his unshakable belief that he was playing a rigged game he couldn't possibly lose, is exactly what provided the state of Florida with the ultimate smoking gun. The audio recording of that phone call represents the catastrophic failure of the entire Duggar empire's philosophy. It proves, once and for all, that their internal justice system is a complete sham, a house of cards that collapses the very second it is exposed to the real world. The psychological collapse Joseph must have experienced in the aftermath of his arrest is almost impossible to fully comprehend. He was entirely isolated, cut off from the powerful echo chamber of the Duggar compound that had affirmed his every action since birth. He could no longer hide behind his father's money, his family's reality television legacy, or the suffocating silence of his religious community. He was left alone with the echoes of his own voice, trapped on a digital recording, calmly destroying his own life because he was too arrogant and too brainwashed to realize the outside world had finally breached the walls of his sheltered existence. The family's golden era is officially dead and buried. The false image they sold to millions of viewers for over a decade has been incinerated by the brutal reality of their own actions. The first cracks in their armor, The warning signs they arrogantly ignored for years have finally shattered their dynasty into a million unfixable pieces. The catalyst of one brave 14-year-old girl coming forward in March 2026 was the spark. But it was Joseph's own staggering hubris, his desperate cover-up attempt disguised as a spiritual confession, and his complete inability to recognize that the game was over, that fueled the inferno of his downfall. The betrayal of the cult's unwritten rules by the victim's family is a masterclass in righteous justice, legally and utterly destroying the Duggar system of cover-ups forever. But nothing will ever surpass the ultimate irony that the exact religious indoctrination Jim Bob Duggar forced upon his children to protect his empire is the very thing that handed law enforcement a recorded, irrefutable confession, putting his own son behind bars. Now I turn it over to you, the viewers, because we need to dissect this incredible psychological collapse together. Did Joseph Duggar's sheer, unadulterated arrogance seal his fate, convincing him he was so untouchable that he could admit to a crime and just walk away? Or did he genuinely, due to a lifetime of extreme religious brainwashing, simply not realize the police were listening, truly believing he was participating in a private, spiritually binding church ritual that the law couldn't touch? What do you think was going through his mind the exact moment those handcuffs clicked and he realized his own religion was the trap? Drop your exclusive theories in the comments below, because I read every single one of them. We are exposing the darkest corners of this family's history, and your insights keep this investigation alive. If you are shocked by the brilliant, devastating trap set by the victim's father, and you want to stay completely up to date on every single recent update regarding the Duggar family's ongoing legal nightmare, you absolutely must hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel. Turn on those notification bells so you never miss a deep dive into the truth behind the reality television lies. The 19 kids and counting empire is falling, and we are going to be here documenting every single glorious moment of justice. Drop your theories below, hit like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video as we continue to tear down the facade.